In this video, you'll learn how eclipses foretold the beginning, middle, and end of history's greatest pandemics. And we'll use that information to look at the future of the coronavirus to make reasonable predictions about how and when it will end. I'm going to go through some facts pretty quickly, just to put them on the table and show you what they all are, and then I'll pull them together so we can digest them better and get a clearer idea of which things recur the most. Let's start with the oldest pandemic that we have a reasonably good historical account of, the Justinian Plague. This one began in 541 and seemed to end in 542, but actually went on for more than 200 years in regular recurrences of decreasing intensity until 750. Here is what I isolate as the eclipse, indicating the start of the Justinian Plague. It's a solar eclipse, which is 5 degrees from the southern solstice. This is the key point. And this eclipse has the aspect of both malefics, Saturn and Mars. And these aspects are very, very exact and strong. Then this is the eclipse that indicates the initial end of the Justinian Plague in 542. So this eclipse occurs at the end of 541. What you see here is that Saturn has gone retrograde and then direct, passing its original position. So Saturn is in connection with its original position from the starting eclipse, and Venus is also there on Saturn at the time of this eclipse, and that Mars, who previously was not in the eclipse, now is. Now this is the eclipse that indicates the true ending of the first plague, the Justinian Plague, in 721 early, April 721. Key points that I want to point out to you here are the eclipse is in Ashvini, which is a health positive nakshatra, and that both Jupiter and Saturn are transiting the positions of the eclipse. Meanwhile, the eclipse itself is transiting the positions of where Jupiter and Saturn were in the original eclipse. Okay, now let's look at Black Plague and see if we note any similarities with Justinian Plague. The Black Plague began in 1346, had a dramatic peak between 1347 and 1351. So it was raging between 1347 and 1351, although it began in 1346, and it totally ended by 1353. Here's the eclipse that I isolate as the first indicator of the start, which also the astrologers at the time thought of as the main indicator of the plague. So this is a solar eclipse which straddles the northern equinox. By straddle, I mean the node itself is on one side of the equinox, and the sun and moon, which are doing the eclipsing, are on the other side of the equinox. So with Justinian Plague, we had the eclipse at the solstice, and with Black Plague at an equinox. But the key thing here, and what the astrologers of the time especially noted, is that you have a very unusual conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter together in basically at 16 degrees of Aquarius. Here is the second indicator of the start of the Black Plague, which is September 26, 1345. This is another solar eclipse. This one straddles the southern equinox. So you have Rahu, the node, on one side of the equinox, and then the sun and moon being eclipsed on the other side of the equinox. You still have Jupiter and Saturn at 16 degrees of Aquarius because of their stationing. And furthermore, you have Mars, who moves quickly, so therefore leaves that area, but comes back to the position where for the first time it fully aspects. So Mars is just coming to fully aspect 16 degrees Aquarius, so it's basically the same scenario in 16 degrees Aquarius. You got Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn combined there. Furthermore, because Mars is also debilitated, and because it's aspecting Jupiter and Saturn from where it is, it's also aspecting the sun and moon, which are being eclipsed. Now, the two eclipses that we looked at so far were previous to the really terrible outbreak of the Black Plague. They were just the beginnings or the start of the Black Plague, kind of similar to when coronavirus was getting started in China. Here is the eclipse that indicates the actual outbreak where it became an international disaster. This solar eclipse, look where Mars is. Mars is back at 16 degrees Aquarius. Meanwhile, Saturn has moved from 16 degrees Aquarius directly into the eclipse. And what you have is the eclipse is therefore straddled closely by two malefics. So that's, in Vedic astrology, we consider that important when things get bracketed by other things. So the eclipse is bracketed by malefics. And this also occurs right as Ketu is about to go into Aquarius. So it means that the peak of the Black Plague was at its worst while Ketu was transiting Aquarius. That's where the three planets were conjoined. And Saturn stations on the 1345 eclipse location. So you get the node, the eclipse indicator, go to the place of where Saturn was in 1345, and you get Saturn moving to the place where the node was, where the eclipse was in 1345. So this would explain the peak of the Black Plague from 1347 to October 1348, but the peak period continued until 1351. And that's because even when Ketu gets out of Aquarius, there's no real relent to the astrological negativity, because now Saturn goes into Aries and retrogrades in there for quite a while, between November of 1349 till June of 1350. But after Saturn got out of Aries, you got the improvement period, which was 1352 to 1353, and then at 1353 it went away. Now here's what I isolate as the indication of the end of Black Plague. This is the eclipse at September 28, 1353. It's the solar eclipse in Libra, once again, with benefics. You see all the benefics are there. Jupiter, Venus, and Mercury. And without malefics. There's absolutely no malefic influence. Now, additionally and importantly, this eclipse is opposite the point where the nodes were in the original eclipse that started the plague. And it's probably also noteworthy to note that Saturn and Mars are both now aspecting exactly the point of the original eclipse. Now let's take a look at Spanish flu. Spanish flu begins in spring of 1918. Of course, like all epidemics, it's actually impossible to know when it actually began, and it began a bit sooner, but it starts to become felt in the spring of 1918. It peaked dramatically in October and November of that year. And then it disappeared very quickly in the summer of 1919. Here's the eclipse that I identify as the indication of the start of the Spanish flu. It's December 14th, 1917. What you have here is the solar eclipse straddling the southern solstice. So you've got Rahu on one side of the solstice, and you've got the sun and moon on the other side. The eclipse is afflicted by an exact aspect from a malefic, in this case Mars. You might be noting the commonalities of all these start points, but I've done a video on that already. In this video, I'm more interested in how the future is going to play out. Here's what I feel is the astrological indicator for that dramatic peak that people suffered between October and November of 1917. It's because Mars has now come to the eclipse position, which before it was just aspecting. And here is the eclipse which indicates the end of the Spanish flu. This is May of 1919. It is, once again, opposite from the original eclipse. Not only is it in the opposite sign from where the eclipse was when it started, but it's actually at the exact location of where Jupiter was in the eclipse that started this epidemic. Meanwhile, Jupiter at this eclipse is doing great, exalted in Cancer with another benefic. Okay, now let's turn our attention to our modern situation, which is the coronavirus. What we have so far as data on coronavirus is that it begins in December 2019. Again, earlier, it starts to get its momentum and everything, but in December 2019, it starts to become a thing. And then it peaked dramatically in March and April of 2020. It exploded all over the world in that month. And then in May, we see a slow but kind of steady decline in the cases. Here's the eclipse that indicates the start of the coronavirus outbreak as an epidemic. It's December 26th, 2019. So what you have here is this solar eclipse at the southern solstice. And it is kind of with Saturn, but it's very strongly involving a debilitated Jupiter, which, by the way, really characterizes this pandemic because there's so much misinformation from everybody and mistrust. Here are the astrological conditions for when coronavirus had its first peak, which was mid-March through mid-April of this year. What you had here was very similar to what you had in the Justinian Plague. Mars, Jupiter, Saturn conjoining, not in Aquarius, but still in the Saturn sign. It's associated with a new moon in Shatabishak, which is a health negative nakshatra. It tends to be associated with health problems. So similar to Spanish flu, where it was when Mars actually came to the location of the eclipse that the outbreak became enormous, same thing happened here. Mars was not directly in the outbreak eclipse, but when it got to that point where the eclipse was, that's when the pandemic broke out on a big scale. And now here's the chart for the small recovery period, or the modest recovery period, which we have from mid-April onward. What we had was another new moon, and this time in Ashwini, which is a health positive nakshatra. And we have Mars dispersing quickly from its contact with Jupiter and Saturn and with the position of the eclipse. And we have the nodes getting ready to change signs and get out of the sign that they were in when the eclipse happened. So now what we want to do is look at all the charts that indicate the ending of the historical pandemics and kind of tally up a few key points. So I'll give you a list now of the factors that we accumulate by looking at the three ending charts for the three pandemics. Some of the ending charts have eclipses that are in health positive nakshatras. Some of them have eclipses where the positions of the planets in that eclipse are directly transiting the positions from the eclipse that started the epidemic. The third thing is some of them have eclipses that are in benefic signs, or with benefic planets, or without malefic planets. So here's a table where I tally up and score these 5 factors in each ending eclipse for the pandemic. The Justinian Plague has 2 ending eclipses, the initial end and then the final end. So if you tally up the score for all 4 of those charts, the most important thing that indicates the end of the pandemic was when you have an eclipse with really important transits to the positions in the original eclipse that started the pandemic. That's the most important. We tallied up 40 points of importance for that. Compared to when you have health positive nakshatras, we tally up 25. When you have the eclipse in the benefic signs, we have 23 points. And these other things about it's with a benefic or it's without a malefic are really didn't come up to be that consequential. So when we look forward at coronavirus to see how and when it's going to end, the main thing that we want to keep an eye on is when will we have an eclipse where the positions of the planets are transiting the original 2019 December eclipse in very important ways. So now let's go through some of the upcoming eclipses. This is the chart for the June 2020 solar eclipse. It's going to be pretty close to opposite from the eclipse that started this pandemic. That's a good sign. Venus is also pretty close to opposite Mars's position at the beginning of the outbreak. And it's in a fairly benefic sign, Gemini. So this one scores pretty good. The one negative thing about it is that Jupiter and Saturn are retrogressing back towards their positions. I think that's a negative sign. So my interpretation for this chart is you get progress, continued progress with dealing with the pandemic. This is the eclipse of December 2020. In this eclipse, we have Venus really close to where Mars was when the pandemic broke out. And you also have Mars aspecting its position from the original eclipse from dignity. You have the eclipse in a very benefic sign, Sagittarius, and what I think is the most fortuitous is you have Jupiter and Saturn finally leaving Capricorn. So this at the very least indicates continued progress through December 2020. The third upcoming eclipse that I want to look at is in June of 2021. And this eclipse, you've got Venus right on the position of Rahu from the Outbreak eclipse. So Venus is really influencing the chart under which coronavirus broke out. You have Saturn very close to the position of Venus in the original eclipse. And you have Jupiter finally getting out of Saturn's signs and getting into dignity in Pisces. So it looks like the progress for coronavirus continues through the first half of 2021. And then the final eclipse that I want to show you is December of 2021. Here you have Mars exactly at the point where it was when coronavirus broke out. And you also have Venus exactly at Saturn's point and Saturn exactly at Venus's point. So there's a lot of interaction between this eclipse and the eclipse that started the pandemic. And that was the key factor in the eclipses that marked the end of the Spanish flu, that marked the end of the Black Plague, and that marked the end of the Justinian Plague. So this is the most important thing. Additionally, the eclipse is still in Sagittarius, so it's still in a very benefic sign. So this one here, I feel, is the best hope, the best match to our template of what kind of eclipses end pandemics. So my conclusion about the future of coronavirus is that 2022 is the first year, let's put it that way, 2022 is the first calendar year where we experience a full recovery. Meanwhile, between now and 2021, I don't really see a major setback. I just see slow, gradual improvement in how we're coping with the virus and how we're solving the problems that it causes. Very much. This is Victor Karras signing out with my astrological research on the eclipses associated with the beginning and end of pandemics. Please don't forget to subscribe to my lovely YouTube channel so that you can get more good, solid astrological information.